Hey, Darksiders. All right, so here we go. Episode 2 of Lovecraft Country. Whitey on the Moon is the name of this episode. So what we're going to do is we are going to recap and then we're going to deep dive into this episode. Please be forewarned that this will be full of spoilers. So if you have not seen it, make sure that you check it out on HBO. Come back and join the conversation because we're going to really get into it with this episode. So I want to share something with you from the outset because I was really fascinated by who this guy was, HP Lovecraft. And shout out to a comment that was made on a prior video that really made me look up some more info about who this guy was. So if you're not aware of it and you're a horror fan, then this guy has had a major influence on horror, in particular bizarre horror. But the things that he has done has really had a major influence on current horror for today's movies. But what you should also know is that he is also well noted for being pretty xenophobic and racist, and it also reflects in a lot of his writing. Now, why is this important? This is important because this show is based on a book by Matt Ruff. So what I love about this is the fact that Ruff was able to take Lovecraft's horror elements but also weave in the racial issue of what's going on in the Jim Crow South, especially given the fact that Lovecraft himself as a writer was pretty racist in his disposition. I think that is what makes this show so fascinating, and that is what makes this show so unique. So I shared this with you not to be controversial, but really just to give you a little bit of context about what's going on here and why the story build is such that it is, and the fact that we really have not seen much like this before. So I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's really great information so you get some context of why the story build is what it is, and it's information that I did not know prior to kind of looking up Lovecraft. So I wanted to give that to you, Darksiders. Now let's jump into episode 2 of Lovecraft Country. So the first thing we notice with episode 2 is that there is something different about Atticus, right? You can tell that he's not like everyone else, beside the fact that he seems to be separated within the narrative, even when we see him in episode 1. But in episode 2, you definitely notice that there's something different about him. Now, here's the thing. Isn't it interesting, right, that when they are in the house, when they are at the Braithwaite Manor, neither George or Letitia can remember what happened the night before. They are totally enamored. Letitia with all the new clothes that she has that just happens to fit perfectly, and George with all of the books that he loves to read, and his room is filled with those, and they're just swept away with all that's going on there. The only person that you notice here that is not acting differently is Atticus. Atticus is the only one that remembers the horrific events of what happened with the night prior. Now, it's only when Atticus brings it to the attention of George and Letitia that, don't you think it's a little bit strange that you don't remember anything from the night before, given this, the fact that we were attacked by beasts, literally, and people were killed, and you remember none of that? And then they start to realize that something's going on here. Now, later on, we actually find out that a spell has been cast by Christina Braithwaite, and that is why they can't remember the events from the nights prior. So we also learned that every time someone encounters the beast that they encountered and they live to tell about it, a spell is cast so that they cannot remember what happens. Now, what I think is interesting here is that this spell apparently does not affect Atticus. He is able to remember everything that has gone on so far. And it's interesting, right? Because when we see these monsters again in the forest, again, George and Letitia forget about what's happened, but Atticus still remembers everything. So here's my first question to you, Darksiders. If you've seen this episode, why do you think it is that Atticus does not forget? Why do you think it is that he is not affected by the spells? Is it the case that he is not affected by the spells because there is something special about him? Or is it the case that Christina, who is casting the spells, is not actually casting the spells so that they affect him? That's a question just for you to mull over, and we can get into that in the comments. Now, as we move further through the episode, we find that the Braithwaites are part of a very old secret society, a society that's steeped in magic and actually goes all the way back to the time of Adam and Eve. So the society is actually gathering for a big dinner later on that night, and we do find out that Uncle George and Atticus are invited to that dinner. Now, here's the interesting thing. Before the dinner actually takes place, Uncle George finds a secret passage in his room, and he finds a book that talks about the rules and bylaws of the society. So when we get to the dinner, we find out that Atticus is what we call a son of a son, and it turns out that his great-great-grandmother was actually a part of that secret society. So therefore, he has an elevated position in that society, one such that he can actually tell folks lower in the society what to do. So as a result of that, Uncle George brings up those rules, and Atticus ends up asking everybody to leave the room except for Mr. Braithwaite, of whom Atticus asks him to return his father to him immediately. But Mr. Braithwaite responds that I'm not going to do that, essentially, and tells Atticus no. As we move through the story, we find that Letitia, George, and Atticus go back to the spot in the town where it appears that they could be keeping his father hostage. They go there and they find some things that belong to his father, so they know in fact that his father was there, but his father was actually nowhere to be found at that location. Well, they search the room and then they find a tunnel, and it appears that his father has gone through that tunnel. Now, here's my question to you. How in fact did his father actually dig that tunnel? Did his father dig that tunnel, or was that tunnel dug for him? Now, when they finally meet up with his father, we see that his father is handcuffed, so I'm thinking that he didn't dig that tunnel, and if he didn't dig that tunnel, then who put that tunnel there for him? That's a question for you all, Darksiders. Again, another question that we can chop it up in the comments about. So after that whole thing happens, they try and leave town. Well, they're trying to cross the bridge to get out of town, and then the car appears to hit what's an invisible barrier, and then we see these runes across the top of a bridge, which looks like, again, another spell has been cast that's not allowing them to leave town. So the car is badly damaged, and then very shortly after, Mr. Braithwaite and his daughter end up coming to the scene. Mr. Braithwaite shoots Letitia, and it appears that she dies. And then Mr. Braithwaite gives Atticus a choice of who will die next, either his Uncle George or Montrose's father, and Mr. Braithwaite actually shoots Uncle George. Now, what we can guess from that is that he threatens to kill his father unless Atticus helps him to fulfill this transference of power through this ceremony. So Atticus agrees to help him do so. Now, once we get back to Braithwaite Manor, we find that Atticus is getting ready for the ceremony, and then he looks and sees that Mr. Braithwaite has actually healed Letitia, so Letitia is fine. Now, though Uncle George is wounded, he is still able to talk, and he's having a conversation with Montrose Freeman, Atticus's father, and there we find out that Atticus might not actually be Montrose's son, but it appears, we don't really know this, but most people are assuming that it appears that Atticus could be Uncle George's son, as earlier on in the episode we see Uncle George dancing with a woman that's not his wife, and the assumption is that it is actually Atticus's mother that he is dancing with, and that something could have went on between those two as she begins to try and kiss him, but he turns away. So as a result of that, a lot of people are assuming that based on the conversation that Montrose and Uncle George are having, that Uncle George could actually be Atticus's father, because it appears that Uncle George had some relationship with Atticus's mom before Montrose did. So then after that, we jump back to the ceremony that's in process, where Mr. Braithwaite is trying to transfer power from or either through Atticus to gain immortality. Now, through the process of transferring that power to Mr. Braithwaite, Atticus sees a vision, a picture of what appears to be his great-great-grandmother. Now, upon focusing on her, he's actually able to break the transference of power, and as a result of that, he kills all of the people immediately around that's helping in the transfer process, as well as Mr. Braithwaite, and the house itself begins to crumble. Atticus runs out of the house following the vision of his grandmother, and we also find that Letitia, Uncle George, and Montrose were able to escape the house as well, but it appears that Uncle George has succumbed to his injuries as a result of leaving the house, and that is where episode 2 ends. So I have to tell you that I really, really like this show, and the more and more I see of it, the more and more I appreciate it. And I feel like you have to watch these episodes more than once to pick up on everything. But what I love about this show is what I said to you before. I think the story build is so good. I think that the characters are really good. Let me tell you, the Journey Smollett, she's hyphen Journey Smollett something, because I believe she's married, is great in this. And I am not a big fan of hers. I've never really liked her much, even since she was a childhood actress, even though she was okay in Birds of Prey. But she nails it on this show. Her performance is really, really good. Every performance on this show is really good. And that's one of the things I love about it. The fact that it's a powerful drama, the fact that we have really interesting storytelling, and the fact that we have what I would consider pretty aggressive storytelling storytelling in the sense that they don't hold back anything. Every episode we've seen so far has been packed full of power, has been packed full of excitement, and has been packed with a lot of high value visual appeal. So it's not like they kind of drug a story out only to give us this visual spectacle in the last 5 or 2 minutes of the show. We get that all throughout the show. It is very, very powerful storytelling from every level. Like, this is an example of a show, I say this all the time, that has high immersion factor because it hits on so many different levels. The storytelling is good, the writing is good, the directing is good, the cinematography is good, the sound design is good. All the elements of this show bring it every single episode, and I feel like episode 2 is no different. Now, here's what will be interesting as we move forward. Number one, to see if they can maintain the intensity, the strength of story, and the visual appeal that the show brings, or will it start to die down? How well will they be able to balance the dramatic aspect of it with all of the cinematic aspects of it as well, and continue for the show to have life, or will it kind of just die down and we get tired of what's going on with the story here? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that this show has been very good so far, and it's been a really, really interesting story build. So we'll see what happens with the next episode. I think the next episode coming up, the title of that, I believe, is Holy Ghost. I'm not really sure. I think that's the title of it based on some of the research I've done online. But I want to know what you think about the second episode of Lovecraft Country. Did you like it? Did you not like it? What are your thoughts on it? And if you didn't like it, especially share the parts where you felt like the story fell apart or where it was not as enjoyable, because I'd be interested to know what you think. I think it's absolutely fantastic. If you want to check out more of what's going on here on Dark Side Reviews, you can click that video right there. That's the wrong side, right there. And I'll meet you there. I always do that, man.